What is going on, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Second Guessing with Stressin. Today, we are joined by local journalist Jonathan Alexander with the Houston Chronicle. Jonathan, welcome. How are you doing today?
I'm good. I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, of course. I mean, like I told you before we got started, this is something I've been wanting to do is kind of highlight some of the people in our local media. The more that I've been doing what I've been doing, I've kind of gotten more of a glimpse into what y'all's lives may be like, and I've grown to have more and more appreciation for you guys. So first off, appreciate everything you guys do, the hard work. All of us fans thoroughly enjoy it, and thank you for coming on today.
Absolutely. I'm glad to be able to share any knowledge I have and share my story as well. But we appreciate you. You've done a great job. Over the past year or so. I started seeing your content probably back then, and you keep us informed too. With a lot of the videos. So congratulations to what you do.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, and my whole take is like I've always been like, I'm born and raised in Houston. I've always been like obsessed with Houston sports. I'm already consuming all this content. And so I finally created an account and basically I just share what I, find interesting. So I'm just taking that extra step. So I definitely enjoy it. But, one thing that I like to do is, get to know you guys. So I'll just kind of ask you if you don't mind giving us a brief background. It could be, as vague or as detailed as you like, but, specifically about your profession, your career, and how you've gotten to this point currently.
Yeah. Okay. So, all right, let's see. Let's start. All right. And I went to school, North Carolina Central University. That's a small HBCU in North Carolina. I studied journalism there. After college, I got a job in that city, in that area, in the Raleigh Durham area, and I started covering news. And I did news for like 3 years. Did a variety of things from like crimes, school, police involved shooting, government, corruption, a lot of that stuff. So I dipped my hand in it, but on the side, I was also doing sports, like as a part-time thing for that company. I was writing feature stories because that was always what I wanted to get into. I always had a passion for sports journalism. So eventually, after 3 years of doing news, they decided to put me on a beat covering recruiting. Covering Duke, Carolina, and North Carolina State. The recruits that would come to those schools and would commit to those schools. So I did that for about a year, and after a year, they had an opening covering Duke basketball, and they put me on that beat, which was a huge step up. I didn't know what I was doing. I was covering Coach K, arguably the greatest college basketball coach of all time. So it was scary but exciting. I found myself earning his respect early on, and really that kind of gave me the confidence to kind of move forward. If I could cover Coach K and ask him tough questions, I could ask anybody tough questions because Coach K will let you hear it. So then after a season covering Duke, they put me on to cover UNC, which was the biggest school in that area, UNC Tar Heels, and I covered them for 2.5 years. Then after that, I wanted to get into the NFL because that's the biggest sport alive. And I covered the Carolina Panthers for 2 seasons. And then the opportunity came to cover the Houston Texans. And I had just been wanting to get out of the state. I'd never been out of North Carolina. My sister had lived in Houston for 6 years. She said great things. And it came with a little bit more money too. So I said, why not? And I hopped on the opportunity to cover the Texans. And 2.5 years, almost 3 years, 3 seasons I've covered now. It's been a great ride so far, and that's my story. So, kind of had to, when I first came into the industry, I was part-time and writing about things that you've never heard of, and now, I get to cover, the most popular sport in the business. So life is pretty good.
Well, that's awesome, man. I'm happy it worked out that way because now we got you here in Houston, and it's pretty cool that you had your sister here. I mean, I guess sometimes you look back and things kind of happen for a reason, So we're definitely blessed to have you. You've been doing a great job covering this off season. But before we dive into that, I guess I'll ask you: have you noticed like any kind of similarities or like any things that stand out to you between covering the Panthers and the Texans, or not even similarities, just any kind of observations you've seen between comparing the two?
Okay, so when I covered the Panthers, I covered them during COVID years. So that first year, I covered them was 2020. So we were like 20 feet away from everybody. We didn't get a chance to go into locker rooms. So we didn't really get a chance to know people. The second year in 2021, things were a little bit more relaxed. You can meet people at coffee shops. I would say there's a big difference between covering the Panthers, who at the time had Matt Rule as a coach, Scott Fitterer as a GM. So it was a different regimen than it is now. But it's very different than covering the Houston Texans. As you all know, Nick Caserio is very buttoned up. He likes to keep a tight circle, doesn't reveal much.
Making your job hard.
Yes. So it took a lot. It took a lot more work. The Panthers, they had so many pots, so many cooks in the kitchen, and people that didn't like each other, and they were looking for somebody to tell information about this. So
Wow.
like I was coming out with scoops. And I even broke the Cam Newton news that he was coming to Carolina at that time. That was probably like my biggest kind of breakthrough and what people have known me for. But so coming to the Texans, I'm thinking like, oh, it's going to be pretty easy. Like, cool. Like, I did it at Carolina. And then no, like, first of all, you had to get to know the fan base. You had to know what they had to like you. And you had to kind of get to know the organization. The organization is a little bit more tight-lipped. They don't talk as much. You kind of have to get to know them and talk to people and have them know you so they can feel comfortable with you. So I learned a ton in these 3 years covering the Texans, and it's been real fruitful. And I think especially this past year was really fun. I had a lot of success, I felt, and covered and wrote a lot of great stories that I couldn't even imagine telling. But it's been great so far.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you've written a handful of great stories, and we look forward to many more. So, I mean, the timing's great. I mean, you come here probably in the second year of the rebuild, and then after that, we're kind of taking off. So I think that helps too, I would imagine, with the overall vibe for you. But with that being said, I mean, there's been a lot of, last offseason was crazy, and then we're coming off another great year this year. And, it wouldn't be a Texans offseason if there wasn't something crazy going on, which was the surprising news of Bobby Slowick being fired. I guess first I'll ask you, one, were you surprised by that decision? And two, after that, what are your thoughts on the Nick Caley hire?
Okay, I wasn't really surprised per se, because in other reporters can kind of tell you, like, I had kind of had an inkling that it was possible. Like a lot of people were down on Bobby Slowick probably before the bye week, before that Jacksonville game. Like, if Bobby Slowick, and I reported this in one of my stories, if the Texans had lost to the Jaguars before the bye week, people in the organization thought that Bobby Slowick could be fired at the bye week. So I wasn't surprised from that standpoint. They ended up winning, and I wrote a story that he may have saved his job. And then you get to the Ravens game, and they lost 31-2. The Texans lost 31-2. So at that point, I knew it was a 50-50 chance. After you get embarrassed that badly, and the offense doesn't score any points, and you got a talent like CJ Stroud, you got a talent like Joe Mixon and Nico Collins, and you don't score a single offensive point. And it doesn't matter how good the Ravens were. They weren't even that great defensively.
Yeah.
I knew that was an indictment. And I knew that there was a 50-50 chance that DeMeco could make the decision. Now, some people were telling me, like, yeah, he's friends with Bobby. He's not going to do it. I didn't believe that 1 second. I know that DeMeco wants to win, and he's going to make a decision that he thinks is best to help the franchise move forward. So from that standpoint, especially when DeMeco made his comments that Monday, and he gave that one-liner about Bobby Slowick, I said, there's a really good chance. I wrote that DeMeco is going to determine the fates of Bobby Slowick, and we knew Chris Strausser was out of there.
And that was unsolicited too, right? He just kind of said that voluntarily, like he wasn't asked. That was like his opening remarks.
Yeah, he said it voluntarily. And usually that 9 times out of 10, that's the nail in the coffin. Now, I do think he thought long and hard about it, but I don't think his mind was made up. But I bet you he was probably leaning towards moving in the direction. And then once he thought about it, his mind was made up. And I reported that ultimately it came down to just the second half adjustments and him feeling like that the defense was a Super Bowl contending defense, but the offense, despite the pieces that they had just couldn't compete and couldn't make adjustments in the second half.
Yeah, I mean, I guarantee you every fan would agree with that. Like I've been saying that all year. Like that was a Super Bowl caliber defense, and like I would even go as far to say as long as we had like an above average offense, we would be competing. Just anything that's not as bad as below average. But I was going to ask about Nick Caley. I guess I'll rewind and ask another question. It'll be about Chip Kelly. I know this may piss some people off, but I know that became like a hot topic. He was someone that I had wanted to take the job. I didn't, necessarily predict that he would get it. And you had reported some good facts on that in your article. And I think you did one recently. Can you kind of touch on, like, obviously he went to the Raiders for a crazy amount of money, $6 million. Was there any kind of conversation and or interest? And then how much of it was money? How much of it was not him being a fit?
Yeah. So I reported last Tuesday, whenever the last mailbag was. I think that was like last Wednesday. I had found out kind of early on, but I didn't have certain facts confirmed until the Tuesday before it dropped. But I had heard from multiple people, two people that they had conversations with, or three people actually. They had conversations with Chip Kelly. And they were more so, and the way it was described to me is they were more so indicators of interest. A lot of times with college coaches, the way one thing was explained to me, a lot of times with college coaches, you more so negotiate a number to see where you come in at with these coaches. And then you don't want to go and have the interview right away because then that messes up recruiting. So they had that feeling out with Chip Kelly. I don't know what he told them, exactly what number he wanted, but I do know they weren't willing to pay him $6 million because they liked the other candidates and they didn't feel like wherever they had Chip Kelly in, they didn't feel like there was a separation enough to pay him that much. Like I report, they liked Nick Caley. They liked some of the other candidates. So they weren't going to pay him that much when they had other good options. Having said that, I had a source tell me that if they really wanted Chip Kelly, they would have paid him that much. So, like, if they had a strong desire, Cal McNair would have had no problem forking up that money, but they just didn't feel that way. Now, could he have been that person? Quite possibly, but it ultimately didn't come down to it. It seems from the outside that he was trying to see who would pay him, the most money. And the Raiders obviously forked up $6 million.
And honestly, as someone who wanted Chip Kelly just, for various reasons, I'm kind of glad to hear that Nick and D'Amico weren't just willing to, basically give in to something like that. And typically if somebody is just money hungry, that's usually not a good start to a relationship. So with that being said, the Nick Caley hire, you were, doing great reporting on that. If you want to provide any insight along the way of things you heard, but then just your thoughts on the hire and kind of how you see things going forward with Nick Caley.
Yeah, I talked to a lot of people about him, and I'll have a story Sunday, hopefully, if I can finish it. But a lot of people have said nothing but great things about Nick Caley, and they all believe, even though this is going to be his first time calling plays, so there's a lot of unknown there. They believe that he's capable of doing it. They believe that he has an ability to connect with a lot of his players, and he's a good teacher. And every stop, he's had many stops along the way, and every stop they said he's one of the hardest workers. He's just been excited to be a coach, and he's done both sides of the ball, offense and defense. Now, the Texans liked him. Of course, Nick Caserio had that connection with them, both being John Carroll products, both being with the Raiders for, I think, 5 or 6 years together. So Nick Caserio had that knowledge of him. Nick Caley interviewed as well in 2023, and they liked him then. He was a finalist then. Before they hired Bobby Slowick. And I think, D'Amico really had more familiarity with Slowick at the time. But what the source told me was what they ultimately liked about Nick Caley was the fact that he is a tight ends coach. So that means he has knowledge of both, and he has his hands in both the running game and the passing game. And they really want to improve both aspects of this offense. They want to improve the running game, and they want to build an offense around CJ Stroud. And they thought that Caley gave them the best chance to do that.
Well, that's good to hear. I mean, we saw how it was, run game struggled and the pass game and, run blocking and pass blocking. So you do kind of hear about, we don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but you hear like the comparisons of all these great coaches or OCs that started out as tight end coaches. So that does make you a little optimistic as a Texans fan. Mr. Optimistic has a good question. I actually just was thinking to ask you this next anyway, so this is great timing, but he's asking about the offensive coaching staff. So I know there's been a couple of announcements, which was retention of Gerard Johnson and the internal promotion of Cole Popovich from assistant O-line coach to O-line coach. And then as well as the hire of Shaplinski, I believe. I forget his first name.
Mm-hmm.
But anyways, I assume he'll be in some kind of senior role. I don't think that's been confirmed. But do you know about the rest of the staff, running backs, tight ends, receivers, what they plan on doing with that?
It seems like a lot of the guys are being retained. I don't know exactly what the staff looks like. We'll find out more tomorrow. Nick Caley's going to speak to the media at 1. So we'll get a lot of those questions answered. But right now, we haven't heard of any. We haven't heard of a lot of guys being laid off that weren't already reported. So, I would think that a lot of the same guys who were on staff, which they had a good staff for the most part, are coming back. But we'll see more tomorrow.
And what are your thoughts on that, like the retention? I know some fans were upset that Gerard was retained and that Cole Popovich was, promoted. I get the logic. I was kind of that logic against Cole Popovich at first. Like, the simple logic of last year's O-line stunk. Why would we promote the same guy? But I kind of rebutted thinking that it may not be the same. What are your thoughts on them retaining those guys?
Well, I know they retained Cole because, him and Nick Caley worked together. That was one thing. And then another thing was, I had talked to a couple of offensive linemen at the end of the season, and they, for some reason, liked Cole Popovich. They had a lot of respect for him. The way the offensive line room was structured as far as the coaching was Zach Ginzer coached pass protection, Cole Popovich coached run game, and Chris Strausser oversaw everything. I had one person say they didn't know why Chris Strausser didn't take over one position when they were struggling. He kind of oversaw everything. So I think from that standpoint, you probably assume that, they didn't feel like the bulk of the offensive line struggles was particularly on what Chris Strausser taught. So I think the fact that he has the respect of at least several offensive linemen, I didn't talk to everybody, but at least I had 2 people tell me that they like. I think that, along with the fact that he has a connection with Nick Caley, and Nick Caley probably thinks that, a new system would probably help him. I think that all of that factored into Chris Strausser being retained.
Yeah, I think, people have to realize too, like, I feel like we're overweighing like what these assistants are able to do, like especially an assistant O-line coach. Like, well, why didn't he say this or say that? It's like he's like 4th or 5th in the chain of command. It's got to be probably pretty tough.
He can't like just talk his boss or say, no, we're not doing that. Like, he can provide suggestions, but ultimately his boss, who's the one who gets the majority of the blame, is going to make the decisions and do what he thinks is best.
And you're doing what you're told by him in the best capacity that you can. So your hands are kind of tied in a sense. So that's what I've been saying is you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You still may have good coaches, good people internally. Just because the person above him may not have been good doesn't mean you get rid of the whole operation. So that's good to hear from your end as well. Sideline Sarah has a question. She asks, has Nick Caserio received an extension yet?
I know he received an extension after the 2023 season. I don't know what the terms of the extension are. I don't know how long he has, but I know he's received at least one extension.
Probably a 2-year deal, knowing him.
Yeah, and
he likes to sign those 2-year deals.
So my understanding was he got the extension when he got that title, that executive vice president. Now, whether he's gotten it this year, I haven't asked anybody. I haven't asked any of my sources but I could try to find out later. But I do know he got an extension back. I think it was last year, maybe.
That's good. It would make sense to align him with D'Amico. I mean, they seem to be working pretty well together, so that's good to hear. Back on Nick Caley, when we were going through the OC search, myself as a fan, I had two concerns, and in hindsight, I admittedly can say that they were kind of overblown as an overreaction to Bobby Slowick. But one was experience, and two was scheme, trying to get away from the Shanahan scheme. So on the surface level, Nick Caley, I had him at my third favorite option behind Jeff Nixon and Brian Johnson, then Jeff Nixon, considering those parameters. But now, like, since I've like kind of dove into it, I feel much better about it. What can you say about those two criteria, experience and then the scheme? Do you think that that's not as much of a factor?
No, I think the scheme still works. I think you have success. I think a lot of the guys who had success, like Mikey McDaniel, Kyle Shanahan, last year, they had their struggles because a lot of them had to deal with injuries on their side of the ball. Also, you saw teams start to use a lot of too high safety looks, which really slowed down what the scheme was able to do, particularly with the Dolphins. And I think, some these coaches didn't make enough adjustments. But every year you see defenses make adjustments to offenses and offenses make adjustments to defenses. Mm-hmm. I bet you those in this Shanahan scheme will figure out a way to make an adjustment to what defenses are trying to do. And we'll see probably more explosive plays. It happens every year. There's a shift. So I wouldn't so much be worried about the scheme so much. But I think it's totally fair to be concerned about the fact that he's a first-time play caller. I think you just have to trust what people say who know him, who think he's ready for the opportunity, who know his preparedness, and say that, I bet. But anytime you go to a first-time play caller, it's a gamble. I think the other candidates, I think Jeff Nixon would have been a good candidate. I covered him in Carolina. So I saw what he was able to do kind of with little resources and using somebody else's offense. And I know a lot of people respected him. You do wonder how, that offense, particularly the one that he was using at Syracuse, would translate to the NFL. But I thought he would have made a good candidate. But that would have meant them changing the entire offense and learning a new offense. And maybe would have had some guys who wouldn't be happy. So maybe that is part of the reason why they didn't go that way. But as far as the scheme goes, I think the scheme still works. I think these offenses just need to find an adjustment. And as far as the play caller thing goes, I think, that's a gamble you make anytime when a guy's calling plays for the first time.
Yeah, and so I've kind of answered those questions myself. I guess, one way to put it simply is, do you trust Nick and D'Amico or not? Like, do you not think that they're asking these same questions? And if they were concerned, they wouldn't have hired the guy. So I know it's kind of, as a fan, you have to put blind trust into people running your team, but that's the way it is. But as far as the scheme too, I mean, the more I've dove into it, hopefully it's the McVay offshoot because he's with the Rams. And if that's the case, it is a little different, which to me, that would be best case scenario. So it's similar to keep things, easy for guys to remember, but with enough variation to make it not the same product as last year. So I feel a lot better about it for sure. Yeah. We got Jeremy Moncia asks, how committed do you think Caserio is on keeping Tunsil and Howard?
Tunsil's going to be here. Tunsil's not going anywhere. I don't understand the sentiment of getting rid of Tunsil.
I don't either.
I know a lot of people are upset about the penalties, but would you rather have somebody who commits 5-yard penalty every other game, or would you rather somebody who gives up a sack every game? I'd rather have the guy who commits a penalty. He improved the penalties over the course of the year. So I just don't get that, and I don't think the Texans view him as a problem. Now, there are certain things that he can improve, most certainly. But I think Laramie Tunsil has been willing to show that he'll do whatever the team needs if you approach him that way. As far as Titus Howard goes, I think his contract is a little bit interesting. Like right now, they can't get rid of him without incurring some type of penalty. And I think they like the fact that he's flexible. And I think you want to keep a guy like him as long as you have uncertainty at the guard position. He kind of saved them kind of mid-season because they didn't have an answer at left guard. And he played left guard, and he didn't do a bad job at left guard. I don't think Titus was great this season, but he wasn't their weakest unit. He wasn't their weakest link. Their weakest link was that guard and that center. And I thought Jared Patterson did a good job kind of coming in. So, no, I don't think either one of those guys will be gone this year.
Well, that's good to hear. I'm going to check in with you real quick. I know you said around 30 to 45 minutes. Are you doing good on time?
I'm doing good on time.
Okay. Whenever you get close, I'll probably check in here in the next 15 minutes or so. But if you get to that point before then, just let me know.
Okay.
Again, the chat is kind of reading my brain. I was going to ask the same question as a follow-up. Sideline Sarah says, do you think we'll run it back with the starting O-line we saw against the Chargers? So that would include, to your point, I feel like Titus does kind of get over-criticized. Like, he did a great job stepping over at guard like in the last quarter of the season. I mean, that's a pretty big difference going from right tackle to left guard. So with that being said, do you see them running that back and then the one fix would just be figuring out right guard?
See, you make a phenomenal point, because I asked Chris Strausser that exact question when we had the one availability with him. We should have got him a little bit more, but I asked him, I said, why not move Titus Howard from right tackle to left guard? And he said, well, it's very difficult to move somebody from that position to that position mid-season. And, I probably shouldn't have trusted him. I probably should have pressed him a little bit more, just considering their struggles. But I asked him that question. And then eventually they made a decision maybe 4 weeks later.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's substance to that. It is extremely hard. But Titus Howard has experience doing that. And exactly. You didn't have another answer at left guard. Kenyon Green wasn't going to get it done. Kendrick Green has never been a starter, a long-term starter, or he hasn't been in a while. So you had no other options. You should have went to that at that moment. And I thought Titus did a great job. I do think that they will. I think there'll be at least one new starter next year, maybe two, but definitely one. And whether they get that person, is probably more likely they'll get that person in the draft, just considering the lack of cap space that they have right now. Now they'll make room and clear some cap space and get more, but there's more than just free agency that they'll need to spend that money on. Injuries, draft picks, that accounts for $10 million. Draft picks counts for $10 million in itself, and then you want to have $8 million for injuries. So they're going to have to figure out a way to clear $20 million in cap space and probably more. But I do think we'll see another left guard or another guard, and maybe two.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of fans are kind of thinking that way. And it's funny too, Titus going to left guard, like you said, it wasn't as bad because he had played it before, but I was calling for it right after the Jets game. Yeah. But it seemed like that was their absolute emergency plan. And then when they finally did it, it was the best iteration of the line we had all year. So that's what was frustrating to me with Bobby Slowick, was he just seemed to make these moves too little, too late. Same with transitioning from zone to gap scheme. Every time we ran a gap scheme design, it seemed to work so much better. And then he waited till the very end to finally do it. It's just come on, bro.
You and me are on the same wavelength. I used to ask the offensive lineman, I'm like, did y'all run a gap when they had, she said, did y'all run gap scheme that game? Yeah, we mixed it up. I'm like, why don't y'all do that more? Be multiple. Obviously, a lot of the players who were drafted or who were on the team were drafted for the gap scheme. So why not use what helps you all affect? Going multiple and using a bit of both is smart. I agree with you. Yeah. They made adjustments a little bit too late. They should have went earlier. They should have seen what was happening. That definitely.
A lot of us saw it. To me, it comes off as stubbornness, or maybe you just didn't have the ability within the scheme, which actually isn't true, because you did it later in the year. And I think DJ Bieneme told me on X in a conversation that, like you said, the players they were the ones who requested to run more gap scheme, which they ran in the playoffs and had a couple of their best running games of the year. So that's what makes you scratch your head and be why does it have to be told from the players and not the OC? So I'm sure that was a big reason why he got let go.
Yeah, I really do think that they thought that maybe the injuries had a lot to do with their struggles. When it was, even though that played a part, it wasn't just that. They were running something that a lot of their
personnel,
players,
right? Like you said, it sucks that you inherited that personnel, but it is what it is. I get you want to try and make this, wide zone scheme work, but at a certain point, you have to cut your losses on the year and do what works, and 100%. Then maybe reassess next year when you have a chance to reassemble your personnel.
100%. So I agree totally.
I think a lot of us are on that same page. So Jacob's got a great question. Let's see if you got any insight on this one. Texans Jacob says, any idea if Diggs' contract is on the table before February 17th deadline with the dead money? From my understanding, from what Texans Cap has reported, he has that void year. He had void years, but a void year with like up to like 17 million in dead cap. And basically, he said like if we essentially don't work out a new deal with him by February 17th, we'll be stuck with that $17 million dead cap. So do you have any inkling of if we'll get a deal done with him anytime soon?
I mean, I agree with Texans Cap, and he is one of the most knowledgeable people about cap. I often lean on him when there might be something super complicated that I can't understand. I'll go to like, hey, Troy, I might need you to kind of explain this to me. So I would definitely. They probably have to at least try, but to me, I think if you ask me, I think Stephon probably wants to at least test the market and see what's out there. Other teams will want him, and that will drive up the price. And I think Stephon probably wants to win and get as much money as he possibly can. And obviously, the injury hurts him a little bit, but he'll probably have options out there. Probably Dallas, probably Washington, and probably Houston. So while I think that they will probably try and engage in talks with his agency, I just knowing Stephon Diggs' history and his belief, I'm not saying that he wouldn't come back to Houston. I think that's possible, but I think he would probably test out the market first.
That's a great point. And us as fans can be upset with that, but you can't blame these guys. I know we always kind of hold on to hope and think, oh, maybe the player will want to win or want to do a favor. But in the end, if we're all making these decisions, it's all about the money, bro. You can't blame them to want.
Their thought process is, I'm getting the most money, and y'all figure out how to make it work. This is what you all get paid to do, but I want to take care of my family as much as possible. And they're not thinking about, well, let me cut back just so I can appease, folks or whatever. It's Nick Caserio's job to figure out how he can get the most talent and make everything work.
Yeah, and so my understanding, and I may be wrong, I'll check with Texans Cap, but basically, if we don't sign him to a new deal before February 17th, that new deal would allow us to restructure the $17 million due in dead cap and spread it out to later years. So he was saying we could sign him to a new deal around 10 to 12 million APY, and that would take his cap from 17 million roughly to 9. And so we would save almost $9 million in cap space if we were to sign him. But I think after that date, we're stuck with that dead cap no matter what. So if I'm understanding that correctly, and basically what you're saying, which makes 1,000% sense, I don't know why I haven't thought of that in that lens, but why would he just want to go to us and not go to the open market? Yeah. It sounds like he's going to go to the open market. It wouldn't make sense to re-sign him, and now you're basically going to have double the hit almost. You're having the dead cap and then the new cap. So if that's the case, I'm just realizing right now, he probably won't be a Texan.
Yeah, if he gets past that deadline, it probably decreases the likeliness from the Texans side to want him. Now, he may want to, but they might figure out that they can't really afford him anymore.
Just because mentally you're going to tell yourself, I'm paying double for him, even though it's, yeah. So that's a crazy revelation. That's a great insight. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Let's see over here. Let's see. Henry Jack says, I guess I'll kind of go into a broader question. We'll get into drafts here in a minute. Let's just talk about the rest of free agency. We got a lot of pending contracts. We got guys. They're not big names, but we got, obviously Diggs was the big one, but Robert Woods, Eric Murray, Mario Edwards, Foley, Dare, Hewitt, Boyd, Barnett, Bryant, etc. And these are guys that aren't superstars, but can be, crucial members of the team. Any of those guys, do you expect to come back? Any inkling on that?
I mean, all right. So I know Robert Woods out the door. I asked Robert, was he going to continue to play? He said they're going to have to carry me off the field. So he wants to continue to play. Now, whether he would come back, I think that's up to the Texans. Do they feel like he can still be effective? But now he was a great leader. He didn't have as much production in the passing game. So they may try to figure out. I'm sure they'll try to weigh, do we need the leadership or do we need
he played it for McVay, so he knows the system.
Yeah, so I think that would make it a more attractive for Robert. Now, would Nick Caley want him? I'm sure that's something that he'll probably evaluate. I don't really know. I talked to Neville Hewitt, and I know that he has a strong desire to be a starter somewhere. And I think he's open to coming back, but I think he wants to at least explore first whether a team will make him a starter. And he doesn't really have that possibility here. So I think if the Texans sign Neville Hewitt, it'll probably be later in the process like he was last year, because he went through the same thing last year. He was trying to see if he could be a starter.
Well, look at Zach Braun for the Eagles. He was a special teamer's backup linebacker, goes to the Eagles, becomes a starter, and he's an all-pro.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't blame Neville, dude.
Yeah. And Neville, when he played, he had success, had that big interception.
Facts.
So he can go and show teams and like, hey, you need a starter? Like, this is what I can do. This I still playing at the top of my game, but don't have a lot of wear and tear on my body. Now the Texans would – I know he is one of Frank Ross's favorite special teams players. So Frank Ross will probably – he'll probably be cheering him on to try to get a starter job, but hey, come back. And I think Neville is comfortable enough. Eric Murray is another guy who I talked to who said he wants to come back. And I think even though he had some ups and downs, I think for the most part he was solid. And I think that they would entertain bringing him back. So I think he's a likely guy to return. Who else is there off the top?
Dare, Foley, and Mario Edwards are probably two big ones too.
Dare makes a lot of sense to return. Foley and Mario are, to me, up in the air, because I do know the Texans want to upgrade at defense tackle. Yeah. Not that they didn't think Mario and Foley did a great job. I think Foley was very key for the run game, but he wasn't healthy all the time. I just think if they find a replacement, then one or two of those guys could leave, and they could go to Atlanta, where our good friend Nate Ollie is over there, and would probably welcome to have them, knowing that he coached them directly. He was responsible for the defensive tackles, and those guys know that they had success with Nate, and probably could have success ever in Atlanta too. So while I think the Texans would probably try to bring those back, I think those guys are kind of 50-50.
But it's probably the matter too of like, we got them, on the cheap, and then they had great years. So now they're probably going to be potentially overpriced, right? I mean, if Nate Ollie likes them, I mean.
Yeah. And I think I don't think they might get a little bit more money, but I don't think they'll be able to get that much money, because both of them, with Foley missing a significant amount of games with injuries, that hurts him. Mm-hmm. And then Mario having a suspension. Mm-hmm. And then when he came back from the suspension, his production wasn't as high as it was before the suspension. So I think that hurts him at the negotiating table, and that makes it more likely that the Texans could probably bring him back on a reasonable deal.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you mentioned Neville Hewitt earlier. I couldn't help but think about, you said Frank Ross loves him, that blocked extra point in the playoff game where he just absolutely blew up the kicker for the Chargers. That was an awesome moment.
Oh, man. My favorite moment was his RKO. I used to laugh. Yeah. I used to laugh at him about that. Like, bro, like, so you just a wrestler now. Yeah, that was awesome.
That's awesome, man. But so I guess that's a pretty good bow on free agency. I guess we could ask on a couple other names. I know Cooper Kupp is a name. He's not a free agent, but he's on the trade block, potentially getting cut. Supposedly Deebo Samuel wants to get a trade. Is there a chance that they kind of land like a big splash name like that, a receiver?
No, I think it's certainly possible that a guy like Cooper Kupp could land here, just not for the contract that he's on. So what the Texans would probably do is, if they engage in the trade, they would wait until the Rams agreed. This is if Nick Caley wants him, but they would wait till the Rams agreed to take on the majority of his contract, where the Texans will be responsible for only a little bit, or they will wait till free agency which I think is what's ultimately going to happen. Everybody knows that the Rams want to deal, Cooper Kupp. So why not just wait until they cut him? I've seen this happen for a lot of different players. I was covering the Panthers when they made it known that they wanted to trade Teddy Bridgewater, but because everybody knew that Matt Rule wasn't going to move forward with Teddy Bridgewater, they just waited until he was expendable. Until he's cheap, until a free agent. So I think the same thing could potentially happen with Cooper Kupp. They've made their intentions already known. And teams know, unless there are a lot of teams kind of clamoring for him, I think it's likely that he'll be a free agent. But regardless, he won't come in for the same price that he's scheduled to make next year.
Well, that's good to hear. And then, I mean, Deebo Samuel, is that a name that you could see something happening with?
I just can't because of the price tag. I saw he was owed $17 million. You know, teams will try to trade him, but I think he still has some value. Like he's still, what is he, 29, 30?
Yeah, he's getting up there. I think he's
Yeah,
around that age.
I don't think he's as old as Cup, and he did have a down year, but I think he could still argue, and I think he'll still want a lot of money. So I just think while he would seem like a very nice weapon to have, I think he'd just be a little bit out of the Texans' price range at this point.
I tend to be with you as well. I mean, you know, I feel like last offseason kind of gave us fans like a false sense of reality. Like it was just this fantasy offseason, all this money, all these signings. So I've kind of like been preparing myself like maybe one semi-splash signing, nothing too crazy. Is that kind of what you expect? Like nothing crazy, but maybe a potential needle moving move in the free agency?
Yeah, they're nowhere near the same position they were in last year when they had all that money to make those moves. So yeah, I could see one really good signing. I could see them signing somebody for less money who's willing to prove himself, and then that person becomes. They'll probably have to do a lot of that, like what they did in 2023, where they were signing a lot of guys who were hungry on cheap contracts, ready to prove themselves, and it worked. If you find the right guys, I think that's probably the route that they'll have to go to fill their roster because they just don't have the cap space. Again, they'll make room, but it's only but so much room and only but so much restructuring you can do without pushing that to further years when you really do need that money.
When you got to pay CJ Stroud, Will Anderson Jr., Derek Stingley,
Exactly.
probably all going to be in the top of their positions. So yeah, I agree. I mean, you definitely want to win now, but it's probably a delicate balance. I assume you're probably close to go. Are you cool with just a couple more questions?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. So yeah, we'll kind of turn into the draft here. You know, we kind of covered free agency. I guess going into the draft, what would you say, or just overall right now, what are the biggest needs for the Texans right now, position-wise?
You know, I think the biggest need is obviously offensive line. That's going to be my number one, and that's what I'll stay. And that's unless they sign somebody in free agency, that's not going to change for me. And how I view, and I think they view themselves as needing an offensive line. I think number two is going to end up for them being a defensive tackle. I think D'Amico Ryans really values how important lines are, both offensive line and defensive line, and we saw how important that defensive line was for the Eagles, and how that offensive line for the Chiefs struggled. So that shows you what wins games. And then I think wide receiver is third after that. You know, just the fact that Tank, there's a lot of uncertainty around Tank and whether he could, just considering the nature of his knee injury, could even be available in 2025. They're going to have to either sign somebody or draft somebody, a wide receiver to kind of, you know, fill in. I think there are possible options out there, free agency. And I hear it's a pretty good draft for wide receivers. So I think they'll address that at some point somehow.
And, you know, in my opinion, you know, if it's not like a top tier receiver, like I don't want to say dime a dozen, but like the talent depth at wide receiver at the NFL level is like plentiful. Every year it's deep. I mean, you look at just on our own roster, Nico Collins and Tank Dell both drafted in the third round. So
100%.
I know we want to focus on the first round, but to your point, if there's other needs that are equal or more pressing, it might make sense to kind of wait. And then you could also argue too, with a quarterback like CJ Stroud, he can do more with less, or he can, you know, further elevate guys' games. I mean, we saw it his first and second year, you know, bringing up the level of his receivers. So
yeah,
I think that's something to keep in mind.
I think when you give somebody time, I think that makes it a lot easier for everybody else around you. You can scheme guys open. Guys can get open. You give CJ time to make plays. I think that's arguably the most important part of an offense. Like, you can have all the wide receivers you want, but if you don't have a line protecting that person, he's not going to find those wide receivers. But you can, like, I still watch some Carolina Panthers from time to time because I'm interested in to see what Bryce Young does. He didn't have a ton of weapons, but he had an offensive line that protect the heck out of him. And that's why he was able to have success over that second half of the season. Like he has good receivers, but they're not separators. They're not super speedy guys.
Yeah.
Adam Thielen is not a super speedy guy. Jalen Coker is not a super speedy guy, but that offensive line gave him time. I watched the Eagles game because the Texans had a bye that week, and they gave him time. And he found receivers who I thought were pretty good, but not great.
I mean, I agree with that. I mean, case in point was Super Bowl. Patrick Mahomes,
Yeah.
the best quarterback, had one of the worst games we've ever seen by any quarterback because he had pressure. And then on the flip side, you talk about, quarterbacks, as long as they have time, they can do more with less. Look at Tom Brady. I mean, I know Gronk was a great tight end, but like he had Randy Moss at a time, but he very rarely had a bunch of a stable of wide receivers. He just had time and was efficient. So,
100%.
you're kind of getting my thinking shifting as well. I mean, I agree with that sentiment. I would, with that context, definitely prioritize O-line over that. So, I guess, are there any names that you're looking at in the draft early on that you think we might be interested in?
I mean, all right. So what I know about the Texans, and particularly D'Amico Ryans and Nick Caserio, is they always in the first and second rounds, particularly first round, draft players from big name programs. That is their thing. They believe strongly that guys from big name programs are able to perform under the lights. Kamari Lassiter performs under the lights. CJ Stroud, Will Anderson, all those guys are from big name programs. That is no coincidence that they draft those guys early. So I think that you'll likely see that here. And when I look at guys in positions of need, I look at Tyler Booker from Alabama. I look at Donovan Jackson from Ohio State. There are other guys who could also fit that mold. I do think, though, that let's say Tyler Booker's off the board, Donovan Jackson, they feel a little bit less about him, that he could fall to the second round. They could draft a different position, and I think they would probably choose defensive tackle, in my opinion, if one is there, and then try to move up or try to choose a guy like Donovan Jackson early in the second round. So I think those are the names to watch for. I've seen people all over the place on Donovan Jackson, so I really don't know where he falls. I'd have to talk a little bit more with some of the people I trust a lot. One of the guys, Jordan Reed, who I went to school with, who's a good friend. He went to North Carolina Central at the same time. I used to cover him.
Really?
He was a quarterback of the team, and I used to cover him. And it's amazing to see how he's grown.
We got to do a live with me, you, and him, and let him give his analysis.
Yeah, for sure. He knows what he's talking about when it comes to the draft. I trust him. Anytime it comes to draft stuff. So I'll have to talk to him when I see him at the combine and kind of get his thoughts a little bit more on where he thinks a lot of these guys will fall.
I mean, those names you mentioned, I would be more than happy with, and I agree. I think we realize that too, and that they draft big name players, and I kind of like the sentiment. I mean, we haven't had very many big name players not pan out, so I mean, it seems like a sound strategy. I can't be mad at that. Are you okay for just a couple more questions? Or
yeah, for sure.
Okay, all right. Sideline Sarah says, could you see anyone on the team possibly getting traded?
Trades don't happen too often unless a guy is like wanting a contract and they're trying to get money, or they're trying to get compensation for him. So I don't really see. I haven't identified a guy who may get traded now. Could it happen? It's always possible. But a lot of the guys who y'all probably want to get traded, if they got traded, the Texans would be penalized for it. Like, I'm sure a lot of guys want Dalton Schultz traded, but the Texans would, being the fact that he just signed a contract, they would lose money in the cap if they traded a guy like him. But I can't think of anybody off the top of the head who would seem like a logical trade option right now.
Well, it takes two to tango too, right? Like you said, like we may want to trade somebody, but somebody has to want them as well.
100%.
And usually the guy you want to trade, nobody wants.
Yeah, like I agree with that 100%.
Well, Jeremy Beedling, I assume that's how you pronounce your last name. He's got a great YouTube channel. He says odds of a D-Hop return.
I mean, I think the fact that doesn't D-Hop's mom still live in Houston, or he still has family?
I believe so.
Yeah, he still has that connection. I think the fact that he's a free agent and that he likes Houston and would probably be willing to hear them out, and was willing in the past to hear them out, probably would make it likely that the Texans would probably look at it. But, I don't know if that would happen. I don't know if it makes total sense. He didn't. He was solid, but he wasn't great. and you can only expect him to kind of go down. So I think it's possible, but I don't know. I think the Texans are more likely to sign a guy like to re-sign Stephon Diggs or figure out a way to get Cooper Kupp here than DeAndre Hopkins. But I wouldn't rule it out. But I don't have it on my radar as like, yeah, this is going to happen.
Yeah, and I think too, like, maybe he's the receiver that he may not be at the level that we think of when we think of his name. So,
Yeah.
I mean, regardless, like, what's fun in all this, like, I'm asking you questions about the draft and we all want to know, but like, it's hard to really formulate what you think we're going to do when we have all these holes to fill prior in free agency. So,
yeah, I mean, and free agency really does change things. Like, you should see mock drafts before free agency and after free agency. They are completely different. And having done a lot of mock drafts over the year, it makes me laugh at how much they change because free agency does change how teams approach the draft.
and I've been fighting the itch. I have yet to do one because of that reason. I mean, I feel like you just kind of waste all this time. Like, you're trying to hypothesize that they're doing this or doing that.
Man, I learned a long time ago. I was covering the Panthers, and it was funny. Everybody assumed that the Panthers wanted at the time. This is like 2021. Wanted what's the quarterback who was played for Pittsburgh and is on the Eagles now?
Kenny Pickett.
Yeah, everybody assumed the Panthers wanted Kenny Pickett. There was some prominent reporters who had mocked, Kenny Pickett, and I remember asking like some people within the organization. I won't mention their names, and I'm like, y'all really want Kenny Pickett? And they're like, nah, we just want people to think that so somebody else will trade up to get him so we could get a better player.
That's crazy.
Like, that happens all the time. Like, so I just don't – people use a lot of these mock draft guys to get what they actually want. Like, people play the game, and the Texans really don't reveal who they really keep it tight-knit. They don't tell anybody who they want. Now, if you get somebody who really feels strongly, it's probably – because somebody else said, hey, like one time I got one of my sources from Ohio State told me, like, hey, the Texans have been calling a lot about CJ Stroud. So, I think they have a lot of interest in him. So I was able to put it out from there, but it wasn't from somebody with Texans because the Texans really do keep it tight-lipped about who they want because they don't want teams. They don't want teams to know. They don't want other people to give it up. And a lot of other teams around the NFL are like that.
And so that's interesting to hear you say at the Panthers that they would basically, like, you've mentioned a couple things early on. You mentioned like they got disgruntled with certain reporters, so they would feed other guys stuff, and it sounded like you may have benefited from that some. But then you also, was that correct? I didn't mean to.
Yeah. So like I was saying, like they must have leaked to a reporter that they might be interested in Kenny Pickett, but it was only so other teams could get scared.
Yeah. And so that was a second example. Like, you kind of hear that as a fan, but you don't know if it actually happens. So like, it sounds like it actually does happen. And
100%.
do you know if the Texans do that at all? Like, if they put out leaks or smoke screens?
No. So the Texans don't put out leaks and they don't put out smoke screens like that. They just keep their mouth shut and they let people talk and let people, run with things. And they want it to be as vague as possible.
And that's got to be a tough job. Like, this is a separate question, but like, as a reporter, like, your job is to figure out what's going on.
Yeah.
And their job is they don't want you to know to ruin it. So it's like, if you are good at your job, it kind of makes them not like you. Is that like a weird kind of conundrum?
I think there's a working relationship. Like there are some things that I have to report that I think, even though they might not like, I have to report it. And then there are some things that I may know that they really don't want to get out there, and I don't think that that's important, so I might not report it. Just to form that working relationship, I think there's a balance in there, and I think people understand that you have to do a job, and I think as long as you're honest with people, then they can respect that. And I've built my reputation based on fairness and honesty, and always being transparent. Nobody has to ever wonder what my motive is because I am very clear and I'm a straight shooter, and I'm gonna always be honest with people and be fair to people. And I think that's why, I've had success because I stick to those principles.
That's good to hear. I mean, and that's one thing I've observed is like the Houston media. I don't know how the rest of other teams or cities are, but like, I feel like our media is awesome. Like, one, just like y'all's hard work and covering the team, and two, like how down to earth and accessible y'all are. Like, example, you coming on the show and chatting with us fans. So that's awesome to me. But I've appreciated your time. It's probably good to let you go here. Before we go, is there anything you'd like to shout out? Something you're working on? Anything like that?
I would say like some stories that are coming out pretty soon that I can't say what they are. But be on the lookout. We'll probably have some stories probably within the next few days or early next week. And just please be on the lookout for our coverage. I'll try to give you all as much as possible. I'll have a story on Nick Caley. I don't mind saying that for this Sunday. And I'll try to do my mock job, but understand that it'll probably change, come free agency. And I'm going to try to do my own kind of big board as I start to talk to more people and kind of get a better understanding of what's out there. So just follow along for our content. And also please consider subscribing. I know sometimes it gets to be a lot of money, but if you subscribe early, you get 25 cents. And that really contributes to a lot of the work that we do. And it allows us to be able to travel to games and to be able to do the great work that we do. And anytime y'all have suggestions about content y'all like to see, just let me know. But I appreciate your support. I really do.
Yeah, of course. And like anytime you need help with anything, like I've been fortunate enough to build a platform, and like, my whole thing is like I try and, trickle that down to other people. So like, feel free to reach out. And I will say too, like I am subscribed to the Chronicle. Like it's, like I understand like it's just like a mental thing in our brain sometimes when you see a paywall, but like if you think about it, like the money you're spending on that is like nothing. We have no problem spending money elsewhere, but then want to decide whether reading something we want to read is worth paying for. I would urge anyone who has that second guess to go ahead and do it, because it's definitely worth it in my opinion.
And a little secret, if it gets too much, call them and say, hey, it's getting to be too much. Can you give me a better deal? And they'll give you a good deal.
Hey, I like that piece of advice right there. Yeah. Well, Jonathan, I'm probably going to stay on. Again, appreciate you. Hopefully we'll talk again soon, and, we'll be in touch, I'm sure, tweeting at each other. But in the meantime, we look forward to your questions tomorrow with Nick Caley. I mean, I can't wait for that interview. So I'm sure you got some good questions lined up. But appreciate you, and I guess we'll see you soon, man.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you, and appreciate everybody listening and asking the questions. And hopefully I'll be back on soon.
All right, man. Appreciate it, bro.
Right. See you.
All right. Yeah, appreciate it, guys. I'll take some more questions. Just keep it going real quick in case I didn't get to you. I try to get to most of them during an interview. I know it's kind of not the best to do, to weave in and out. But I see someone said that Breggy went to Boston. That sucks, but it also is nice to finally get that out of the way. That's been a long, drawn-out thing. The fact that, that was just, I'm sure we're all burnt out on that. So, Johnny Lambo says, by the way, this Rockets Suns game has been so much fun to watch. I am bummed that I'm missing it. I am checking the box score, and the Rockets are up 115 to 106. That is awesome. That makes me happy. I am blessing on that. Retreat to Hell says, no, sir. Tomorrow we will. He's talking about the Caley interview. And yep, they will have the Caley interview tomorrow at 1 p.m. And then MJK316, Bregman, 3 years, $120 million to Boston. Man, he got paid. So long, Breggy. Sad. Johnny Lambo says, right. Johnny Lambo says, interested to hear what he says about the O-line and tight end room. We didn't talk about tight end room too much, but O-line, he says that we for sure need to get a right guard. And it sounds like he might, want to run back the lineup that, I would want to run back, which is Titus at left guard, Patterson at center, and Blake Fisher at right tackle, and then just figure out the right guard spot for Shaq Mason. And Johnny says Dylan Brooks is such an awesome piece on this team. Dylan the villain, baby. I love it. Jamal Connor says, thanks you all. Thanks for tuning in, bro. Henry Jack says, who should the Texans draft at the 25th overall pick? Yeah, we kind of touched on that. I mean, it's hard to, say that right now with the different holes. We talked about the different needs. Obviously, Jonathan said positions I agree with: O-line, interior D-line, and receiver. I would argue that receiver was more of a need than what he said at the moment, because we have 2 vacancies. So I would assume, though, that we do sign at least one veteran free agent receiver, whether it's, the outside Z receiver to play in place for Tank Dell, or whether it's a slot receiver. But so with that being said, and it's tough too, like O-line, I don't know typically how it works out in the first round, but it could be an O-lineman. I like Gray Zabel out of North Dakota State. Donovan Jackson was a name he mentioned. So, I mean, there's some options there. I really don't know for sure, but there's a lot of names I like overall. MJK says wide receiver options for Texans via drafts or free agency. Yeah, so I kind of just answered that. I think it's a mix. I would prefer to go, unless we get Emeka Egbuka in the first, like because I feel like, if we don't sign a veteran slot receiver and we sign like an outside Z receiver, drafting Emeka Egbuka, typically I wouldn't want to do that in the first round. I still feel like that would be worth it. I feel like he is a perfect slot receiver. He has the chemistry with CJ Stroud. He's a tough physical receiver who can make those contested catches. You really need that security blanket, which is what Stephon Diggs was before he got hurt. Basically that reliable third down receiver who can read the defense, run the hot route, recognize the blitz, make a catch in traffic, someone the quarterback can rely on. And then MJK says opt out for Breggy each year. Wow, 3-year deal with an opt out for each year. That's crazy. Johnny Lambo says I want Matthew Golden. I would like Matthew Golden too. So if we were to keep, it's like I kind of look at the receiver position probably too analytically. I know some people get kind of frustrated, but for me, you got the big X receiver, which is your bigger field stretcher guy, which is Nico, and that's like the most limited in terms of route tree, but it's also the hardest position to lock down. So when you get an X, you want that receiver to kind of hold down that role more often than not, and rather than move them around, even though they can, you want to keep them there. So we got that X receiver. Tank Dell is the Z, and he's hurt, more than likely most of the year, which is kind of a hybrid between X and slot, where basically you can play outside and inside, more of a versatile. And then slot is what Diggs played, even though he played Z when it was 2 wide receiver sets, but he was like 50% of his snaps were in the slot. So basically we need a slot and a Z. And between those two, like if we were to sign Diggs or like Cooper Kupp, if we were to trade for him, that would be another slot receiver. Keenan Allen, Chris Godwin, not going to happen. But just to give you an idea of like names, like types of receivers, those would be the slot receivers that we could get. If we were to get one of those, then you would draft a Z, which would be Matthew Golden. Another name I like is Kyle Williams out of Washington State. There's a couple other names that kind of fit that profile where you're not quite the big X receiver, but you're also not the, smaller, grittier slot receiver. You're kind of a hybrid between the two. But then vice versa. If we were to sign, a veteran Z receiver, I need to look at the free agents, but I know Demarcus Robinson is a cheap option from the Rams. Then now you go and draft the slot. That's kind of the approach I would take, is draft one, sign one. And then, you could sign another guy for depth too. But as far as wide receiver 2 and 3, so Engineer says, thank God Bregman is gone. Yeah, and Texans Jacob Jalen Royals. I mean, he's a great name. Both Iowa State receivers are great. I mean, there's a lot of receivers like there is every year. So, and then MJK says Booker, the guard from Bama, is a road grader. I mean, yeah, I would be cool with that too. Like, again, it's hard to kind of say without free agency hitting, but no, this is exciting. Johnny Lambo, shout out to you on the sports updates. Rockets win 119-111. LFG, great game to watch, back and forth the whole time. I'm bummed I missed it, but I enjoyed it, and I appreciate the update. I'm glad the Rockets are back on track, man. And then MJK says, stay away from Kupp. He's heading downhill. Unknown says, O-line needs to go like left tackle Laramie Tunsil, left guard center Juice Scruggs, right guard Will Fries, right tackle Emery Nunn. Yeah, I mean, I agree with most of that basically. And I personally think the O-line may not be as bad as we expect. I feel like it felt really, really bad, like, just over halfway through the year. And then, we had the change and with Titus at left guard and realized it's not as bad. I think, with the changes, and I think with the new OC, with Caley, if he runs more gap scheme, which we talked about on the show already, that alone will have a big boost. And then as a result, if you run more gap scheme, you tend to run more man pass protection as opposed to slide pass protection, which is what we ran, which is essentially like a zone pass protection, which was the ones where you're having to like communicate and figure stuff out. I think just from schematics alone, the O-line can improve. And I think the personnel isn't as bad as we think if we run it with Titus at left guard rather than him going to left guard 3/4 through the season. Now he has a full offseason to do it. And now you just really at the least have to figure out the right guard spot. Patterson really isn't bad at center. And honestly, Juice Scruggs he played pretty good at right guard. I mean, it still blows my mind that D'Amico decided to start Shaq Mason over Juice Scruggs in that final game against the Chiefs. But, I think it's definitely not as bad as most people think, but we definitely still need to address it. And I'm hoping a lot of it is fixed just simply by the OC. Brandon Hallman, yeah, it's another great name. I mean, there's a lot of great naming receivers. Jack Beck is another great name. Jack Beck, if Caley wants a Puka/Cup build. Yeah, I mean, he's very similar to Puka. He's like a big slot. I mean, he's more of a possession receiver. Normally, I wouldn't like that type of receiver myself, but that's the thing about this offense, too. It's a little different. He tends to like these bigger physical guys. We had talked about it, too, a lot of use of motion, motioning guys, into the box and having them run through the C gap and blocking linebackers and then running play action. You get a bigger, sturdier receiver that can thrive in that role. Yeah, and then Brandon says you forget Fisher exists. Yeah, I think the comment before forgot to mention Fisher. I'm having a tough time talking right now. Sorry, guys. MJK, we don't have very much cap space, like 2 to 4 million. Yeah, so we have like 3 million, but then Texans cap said that we could clear up to 40 million, depending off of restructures. I think that Nico Collins is a potential contract eligible for restructure. So is Shaq Mason. I forget the other 2 or 3 off the top of my head, but between restructures, between the cap increasing, they usually increase it by a certain percentage each year. I think that's a big part of it. And between, releasing some guys, those are ways that the cap could go up to 40 million. And then again, like Jonathan said, though, you could do restructures, but then you're basically just kicking the can down the road for other guys rolling their money to later. And so while you could free up more money this year by doing that, now you have less money in future years. And those same future years, you have to do new contracts for CJ Stroud, Derek Stingley, Will Anderson Jr. So it's kind of a delicate balance of how much do you want to go all in this year and risking having to, disrupt things in later years. So it's a tough situation. I don't think our cap is a great situation. And then let's see. Henry Jack says, should the Texans draft an Ohio State running back in the second round after the Texans draft O-line? Maybe Quishon Junkins. I wish, dude, he's good, but I mean, we have too many other pressing needs, in my opinion, to do that. That would be kind of reckless. Joe Mixon's a great back. He's a bell cow back. You look at the Rams with Kyron Williams. He was a bell cow back. He carried the brunt of the work with them. So it very well could be the same thing with Mixon and Travion Henderson. I would like him as like a change of pace back. You could probably get him later in the mid rounds. But I mean, Dameon Pierce is somebody that could be revitalized in this Nick Caley offense. We all know that he's not a great zone runner, not good with vision. He's more of a downhill, run you over running back, which translates to gap, which we're hoping that Caley can do, coming from the McVay version of the Shanahan scheme where they've shown where they can run gap. So, if Pierce can be unlocked, I mean, I couldn't justify taking a running back in the second. Johnny says, Dalton Schultz had mentioned in his first year that Bobby Slowick came in, started talking blocking schemes immediately, starting to wonder if that threw them off track. Yeah, so I actually tracked that. I was very aware since the beginning that the wide zone scheme and the Shanahan scheme that they're known for is a very tough. Like, first off, not everybody runs it. Like your traditional offense, you don't run the wide zone. You just run gap scheme where hey, block the man in front of you. Typically, mano-a-mano football. So one, it's new to a lot of people, and two, it's actually like pretty advanced. Like it's very, very technical. Dalton Schultz had several clips over the years through training camp and press conferences talking about the blocking scheme and how advanced it is. And that's something I dove into, and it's been known that, it takes time. So there's, jumps from year 1 to year 2. So the first year you're struggling, everyone's getting used to it. Second year you get better. And then from year 2 to year 3, which would have been year 3 for us this year, that's when teams really start to take off as far as understanding it. But unfortunately for Bobby, he got let go before he could kind of see that next jump. But I mean, we really didn't have much success in year 1 or year 2 running the ball. And I think the big thing is, probably part of it was what you're talking about with Schultz saying that it's a technical, tough to learn scheme, but more so the personnel did not fit. Like we have bigger, heavier guys that just want to block the guy in front of them as opposed to smaller, agile guys who can run out in space and then kind of, be agile. So that's something, it's a super advanced and technical, not only, learning running out the space and then knowing who to block based off leverage, but also like they say, like hand placement is like super key. Like you don't have to be the biggest and strongest lineman, but if you have great technique of where you put your hand and where you put your foot, you can, use your technique and your position and your leverage to take advantage of being undersized and use it to your advantage. So, and then Henry Jack said, should the Rockets sign Kevin Durant? At first was like very against trading anybody. And then we had that stretch where offense was putrid. I know we've had a lot of injuries. I started to think, okay, we all know we need a closer, whether one emerges or not. I'm fine with it. I saw reports that he's a favorite to go to us this summer after the season if we don't part ways with like any of the key pieces. And we have a lot of key pieces. So it just depends, but it would be nice to have a scorer and then a veteran to help, bring those guys along. So depending on the right price, yes. Brandon says there's no way Emory Jones comes in and takes Fisher's spot. Yeah, I think Fisher's getting slept on in this as well. And then Unknown says, is Fisher capable to start, though, is my question. He looked pretty good when he started against the Dolphins, but I just want to be solid and see if he's ready to start and not just a solid backup. Yes, I think he is, and he did. He started like 5 or 6 games and did pretty well as a rookie thrown into the fire against some good defenses too. And then if not, I mean, you hate to do this and play musical chairs, but like if you take the risk, I mean, first off, you drafted him in the 2nd round. So, I mean, you don't just draft a tackle in the 2nd round thinking that he's not going to be capable of being a starter in year 2. So whether he is or he isn't, they think that he is, and they're going to throw him out there. Well, let's just say they do, and he doesn't. You still got Titus. You can always roll him back out to right tackle and, find another left guard. So there's always that option. So I'm more than fine with keeping him out there. And then Brandon says, need more rookie contracts on O-line and wide receiver. Yeah, so that's a good point too. I guess like the way your team is structured, if majority of your rookie contracts for the future are at other positions, then you might consider, drafting those positions. So that's a good point. Johnny says Sting going to get paid this offseason. Facts, and he deserves it all. So I would much rather pay him the max than, splurge elsewhere. I mean, having a lockdown corner is just such a luxury. Brandon says might see them draft another cornerback so they don't need to use up cap space on a position they draft well. Yeah, I mean, they could draft one in, the mid to late rounds for sure. I know a nickel, that's tough though, because our nickel is more of like a star linebacker with Petrie. Hopefully we'll be ready to go. But if they were to draft a nickel, like Miles Bryant was able to play nickel for us, but I think D'Amico would prefer to play like a Petrie, like a linebacker type nickel. Joe Flores, I'm excited about Brevin Jordan next season. Facts, dude. I keep forgetting about him. He was hurt. I think he was primed for a breakout year. And then I'm just so excited about this Nick Caley offense. Like guys like Brevin Jordan, we have a coordinator that we hope from what we've seen and learned and heard about him. He's, potentially super innovative and kind of unlock certain guys. And so maybe, who knows, maybe the hope's not lost on Dalton Schultz. Maybe he finds a way to better use his skill sets. Same with John Mechie. Who knows? I'm not saying so, but this could breathe new life into some guys is all I'm saying. Unknown says, Brandon, I would like to see us get Darian Porter or Kobe Bryant if we do go corner. Brandon says, Porter is the fast one, right? And he says, it's the Iowa State man. This is a great convo. I'm kind of narrating back and forth. And then Brandon says, they said he was a 4.2, 4.3, right? And Unknown says, I don't know. I haven't kept up with his scouting report. And then he also says, I honestly would like to see us draft a running back in later rounds like Ollie Gordon or Jaden Blue. Yeah, I wouldn't mind depth again, as long as we address the other positions first. But it'll be interesting to see. again, we're all going to speculate. I do it too, but I guess I'm just like, I can't wait for free agency to start so we can kind of, have a clearer picture of what we may or may not expect come draft time. But that's the beauty in it all. Brandon says better than paying $5 million for an Okuda. That's true. Yeah. I mean, I guess you could get another corner and have him be just a versatile piece. But yeah, I mean, I appreciate you guys. Normally I go a little bit longer afterwards, but I feel like that interview with Jonathan was pretty good. Like, I feel like we covered a lot of the topics. If we didn't answer any questions, I apologize. Instagram, I did not have the questions going. I apologize. Thanks for tuning in. Same with TikTok. Sorry, I didn't get to y'all's questions. If there's anything I missed that y'all want to know or you just want to talk ball, feel free to hit me up in any of my DMs on Instagram, which is Houston Stressins, or TikTok, Twitter, or is at Texans Commenter. And then YouTube is also at Texans Commenter. Facebook as well as Houston Stressins. My website too. Feel free to subscribe to the free newsletter, HoustonStressins.com. It's right there. Subscribe button. I have like a profile you can create as well. If you do that, you can make a profile where you can use it as your link tree, where you can put in your socials, and instead of using Linktree, you can kind of use that as like your quote unquote website. And I also have a Discord. I haven't quite pushed it. It's there, but like I call it a Discord. It's not Discord itself, but it acts as a Discord. It's like a forum. I would like to get that going. I understand we have our other, apps and stuff we're on, but my big goal, I kind of polled a lot of y'all, was me creating my website into an app. I feel like right now, my website would be great for all of us to interact on, like one ecosystem. And again, not a replacement, just like a supplement to what we all use to consume Texans content. But I feel like an app would be more friendly. Like, for whatever reason, we don't like going to a browser, but I feel like if it was an app and had, my video tab where you can look at all the fresh videos that are embedded from YouTube, have like a forum tab where we can all chat with each other, have like a directory where you can see each content creator, click on their page and see their content right then and there. Have the store where you can look at merch, articles where you can read articles, or you can write articles yourself. I feel like there's a lot there. But I'm hoping to get to it this offseason. I just need things to slow down. It's just the Texans news cycle is 24/7, man. Henry Jack says, do you think Jimmy Butler will take the Warriors back to the NBA Finals and win a championship or not? No, I don't think so. Jimmy Buckets. And then Johnny says, cool to see Frank Oakham on staff. Got Rod Wright and Oakham, former Texas Longhorns D-line studs on staff now. Yeah, that's awesome, man. That was a great hire. I'm excited about that. And then Henry Jack says, are you nervous that the Texans will pass on good players in the 2025 draft? No, I am not. At Nick we trust. I do think, and will say, I'm like very convinced that we'll trade back again. We did it last year. They like that middle second round, basically get an extra pick by trading back. We're in a position where we don't, hopefully after free agency, don't have like some extremely dire needs and can be greedy. So I don't think that they will pass. I mean, you can look back last year and say we passed on Brian Thomas Jr., but, we had already signed Diggs. So, I mean, yes, in hindsight, you did pass on him. And he also played a different position than Diggs, who played our slot. But I'm not worried about it. I mean, there's always good players. There's always a shoulda, woulda, coulda. But I think that you look at the draft we had last year, it was pretty good. And the year before was pretty good. So I'm optimistic. I'm excited. Appreciate you guys. If you need anything, just give me a shout. But other than that, that's all.